Hi guys, Ted Elsner, Sacramento Historical Fencing Academy. So, another beautiful day in California. A little overcast today, but that's fine. Today I have another question for you. Does size matter, right? And particularly for this question, I want to think about and talk about the size of the system that you're working within. Does it matter? Meyer seems, at a glance, like a giant system. When you look at all of the different weapons that he presents, when you look at all of the different guard positions that he shows, all the different cuts, his handworks, it can be very, very overwhelming. But is it true? Is it actually such a large system that we're looking at, or are we just really seeing a lot of variation presented on a theme? For this question, how many different actions do we actually find when we look at Meyer, right? We can break down some of the various things and start to discover that, you know, there's really not as much as it would appear. Before we even talk about actions, let's talk about guard positions. You look at all the various guards that Meyer presents, and, you know, what, 16, 17 of them, depending on how we want to count between guards and parryings. But how many are there actually, right? Arguably, there's 5. There are the 4 primary guards that were given of the Oberhut or Vomtag, Ochs, Flug, and Alber, of course. We have those 4. And then there's what Meyer refers to as his parrying positions of Geradeversetzung, and then also Hangentort / Bogen as well can be considered parries as well. Whereas all the rest of them are just variations on that. They're all some version of one of those guards, certainly from a tactical standpoint. So instead of 16 things, we have 5. All right. What about then for all of the cuts and handworks? Because, man, there are a lot of them going on there. But are there? Are there really? How many cuts does Meyer actually have? There's different ways to count it, and if you've ever actually hung out with me at a class or an event, you've probably heard me kind of jokingly say that there are 5 things in all of Meyer. And to a certain extent, that's almost true, and it really depends on how we want to count things. At its most simplistic, there are 5 cuts. That's it in Meyer. Now, they're not the 5 cuts of the earlier Lichtenau tradition, although some of them are included in there, but it's the way that Meyer approaches those 5 cuts. You have your 4 primary cuts. You have your Oberhau, you have your Zornhau from either side, you have your Mittelhau from either side, and you have your Unterhau from either side. So that's 4. And then you have the short edge version of that, which Meyer notes as the Schielhau, being a short-edged Oberhau, gives us our 5 cuts, from which everything else in the system as far as cuts go can be deduced, right? And this is where we start to have to get into, you know, a little bit of a discussion on how we want to count things, what we agree, what we don't agree. But at the very least, we have those 5 cuts. Let's look at them really fast. Okay, so the first cut, the Oberhau, right? We're going to step with the Oberhau, and we're just going to cut top to bottom. Does it matter which foot is forward? Not especially. Either foot forward is going to be that same vertical strike. So that's 1. Then we have our Zornhau. Now, here's where we run into our first question of, do we have to count these separately? If I cut from that side with uncrossed arms, and I cut from the other side with crossed arms, are they different positions? Yes or no? You have to decide this for yourself. For right now, I'm going to say that no, they're not. They're the same action, just from one side or the other. We have the Mittelhau, right? Where we'll cut across from either side. So for the Mittelhau, same question, right? We just agreed that a crossed arm version and an uncrossed arm version are the same, so we'll continue with that here. And then finally, we have the same thing with the Unterhau. If I cut from my left or my right, does it matter which one I'm using? Is one a different cut than the other? So for now, because we're saying no with the uncrossed arms versus crossed arms, there's our 4 cuts. Then we get into our Schielhau, which Meyer describes as just being an Oberhau, right, from above with the short edge, which we're going to cut out with the short edge and come down through. intersecting our opponent's blade. Okay, so there's our 5. Krumpau. Krumpau is a shield how with crossed hands, right? If I come in with the short edge from above and I step off to the side, that's a Krumpau. But it's also Meyer's new shield how. Conversely, a Krumpau is also a shield how. So are they different cuts? Let's say yes, they are, because the footwork is different. So we've gone 5, that's 6. Okay, what's number 7? Well, let's look at the rest of the Meisterhau. Zwerchhau, right? So Zwerchhau, I'm going to strike up either horizontally or as a more of a rising strike from below with the short edge. Okay, do those need to be counted separately? I don't think so. They're fairly similar as far as motions go. So let's call that motion number 7. What about from the other side? Because that's long edge. Do I need to have that as its own? Well, no, because it's either an Unterhau or a Mittelhau, depending on how we want to count it. And we've already discussed that, and so it's fine. Okay. So we're up to 7. What else do we have left? That's pretty much all the various cuts we're going to run into, right? Even if we start to look at all of Meyer's cuts that are further in. Well, there is one more thing we have to take into account, and that's the flats, right? So if we are going to count flat strikes, like the Prellhau, if we come in with that flat, is it different? Yes, no? Maybe? Okay, let's call it 8, right? Let's call that then the flats give us 8 strikes. Well, what about thrusts? Do thrusts need to be counted separately? Up to you. Is a thrust just a transition from something like Flug out into Langart with the passing step? Does it get counted as its own thing? Is it not? Let's call it 9, okay? So up to 9 motions in the system. What about thrusts from Ox or high guards that are going low? 10? Okay, maybe, right? And you kind of see here where we start to count and we say, well, what is one? What is another? Where does the line get drawn? Or are we overthinking the whole thing? Do I have, 10 motions that I've just discovered or talked about? Do we have these various ones? Or are there really only 2 motions? Arguably, we could take it all the way down to such a small number. We could say that if the blade is moving in a lateral motion from side to side, top to bottom, wherever it is, relative to our opponent, that's a cut. Does it matter if I'm moving forward or back? Does it matter if I'm in a bind? No, it's still a cut. We can still say that it's such a thing. On the other hand, if the point is moving forward or back in a more linear motion, that's a thrust. And so there might only be those 2 motions. So that's kind of the question that we're presenting here is how big does our system need to be? How do we need to define it? Early on, with any system, you're going to find that people tend to only name the absolutely necessary. Oh, I thrust or I cut. Okay, cool. So if I stab you, it's a thrust. If I cut you, it's a cut. It's a how, it's a hew, it's a slice, whatever the term we want to use is. Cool. Okay, well, wait a second. What if I cut you from above to below instead of side to side? Oh, okay, well, that's 2 different cuts. We go here and here. Okay. What if I come in on a 45-degree angle? Oh, okay, that's another one. What if I cut you from my left instead of from my right? Suddenly we have the Italians where they're talking, their mandrito and their reverso. And that's how they've decided they want to define these things. As you go along with the system, this is a natural outgrowth of anything and how you're going to define it. And it's really easy to say, well, this one thing is the same as the other thing, and then decide as you go along, well, it is, but let's give it a separate name so that we can really dial down to it. So when you look at then something like Meyer and you realize, or the Bolognese tradition, whatever, you realize that, you're in a fairly mature fencing system, right? Within the German kind of context by this point, we've taken and moved on from something early like the Lichtenauer tradition where there are, 4 guards and 5 cuts and that's it. And we get to Meyer. Are there more than 4 guards and 5 cuts? Well, arguably, no, there's not. That they're all part of this other thing. But as we find specific use cases for one or another, we name it that specific thing. So how big does your system need to be? It doesn't really matter, right? It's more a question of how big you define it to be. Do you name everything its own thing, or do you just kind of lump them all together and just use the greatest word in the English language, or rather the greatest, I guess, kind of adjective? Adverb? I'm actually not sure on that. Modifier, I guess, right? And say ish. Well, I mean, it's long point ish. It's ox ish. It's this guard ish. It's this cut ish. Should you be flexible with a simple set of names? Should you be more rigid and name everything? Do you like to put things into boxes, or do you like to define it in other ways? And this is something, guys, that's going to come up again and again. When I was talking about provoker, taker, hitter, right? My first action probably should be a provocation. But if you don't respond to the provocation and you just stand there, I should hit you. Does that mean that my initial intent was to hit? No, it was to provoke a response from you. But if you don't respond, I'm just going to continue on and stab you in the face or cut you or whatever the appropriate action is going to be. So realistically, guys, all of this comes down to a question of how we codify our language, how we codify our system, how we choose definitions for terms. We'll argue this till the end of time. But it is something interesting to think about, and I hope as practitioners, it's something that you're at least thinking about for your own internal kind of growth and evolution. Maybe you'll use the terms exactly as your system is presented. Maybe they'll start to take on a particular meaning to you that answer specific questions that your system presents. Some people will feel that's a bad thing. Others will feel it's a good thing. For myself, I'm concerned about personal growth. Are you getting better at your system? If you are, then awesome, great. And so you'll start to understand it better. For other people, maybe not so much. Anyway, guys, hopefully this has been interesting to you today. I find this kind of stuff, especially when I'm cooped up at home, to be really, really interesting. If it has, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. Follow us on Facebook. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Try to respond to every single comment that's left. If I haven't gotten to yours yet, I apologize. But let us know what you think, guys, and keep practicing, keep saying, and we'll see you next time.